I want to invite you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8, please. We'll start there in just a moment. 1 Samuel chapter 8. We have so many reasons to be grateful as a people. God has answered so many of our prayers and just does so on a regular basis. And it gives us reason to be grateful. It gives us reason to be holy to the Lord, as we've just sung. It gives us reason to shine brighter in our light and the world around us because God has filled us up so much. One of my prayers, Lord willing, is going to come true today. Abraham and Omar's mom, Gloria, is going to be with us tonight at the singing. We're going to pick her up after she gets off work today, and she's going to come to the house for a little while. Abraham's going to read a passage tonight when we're in our time together, and so Gloria's going to come to hear him read, and I'm thrilled because she's met some of you, but I would love for her to meet more of you, and so that is a partial answer to a long prayer for us and for that family that we love so much, and I can't wait to hear Abraham read. You're going to love the passage he's going to do. It's going to be great. So that's going to be special too. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, we have in this context actually a passage that we've referred to at least in the Godly Influencers class that John has been leading us in on Sunday and Dave has been leading us in on Wednesday night. It's a passage about the installment of the first king of Israel, Saul. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8 is the passage where the people come to Samuel, their last judge, and they request of him that he set over them a king. And Samuel tries to talk them out of it. In fact, he rebukes them because of their desire for a king like the nations around them. In fact, if you would look at their request in verse 6 of 1 Samuel 8, where it says, or rather verse 5, they said to him, Behold, you've grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And so Samuel prayed about it. God actually told Samuel, and this is a big part of what we're going to talk about today, God told him to grant their request, and said that this reflected actually their rejection of him. And then Samuel goes back and he tells the people with God's instruction what it's going to be like under a king. What kind of things that they can expect from the kind of king that they've asked for, a king like the nations around them. And even after he gives them, I would think, the most persuasive speech that Samuel knew how to muster about the fact that this was not a good decision, look at what is said in verse 19 of the text. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And so after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing, and the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to their voice and appoint them a king. And so Samuel said to the men of Israel, Go every man to his city. I really love and really appreciate where we are as a congregation and what things are being done right now in some of the studies that we're doing with the life of Christ and really getting to know our King, our leader, our Lord, our Savior in that study. I also appreciate what John and Dave are doing in the Godly Influencers class as we think about how we exert influence on one another and in our families and how we exert that influence in our community. And I know that we as a people, as a congregation, have an appetite, have a desire not only to grow our influence, but for God to either grow among us or for God to bring us men who can serve as formal leaders among us, men who can serve as shepherds, as elders, and that we can have that as an element of our equipping and of our growth as a people, because we know that that's part of God's design for churches. And I know that part of our interest in what we're doing right now in our leadership class is toward developing us, our heart, our vision, our appetite for God to fill that kind of void among us. And I bring us to 1 Samuel chapter 8 and this story because it really teaches us many, but one particular leadership lesson that I hope can be helpful to us in terms of how we develop our appetite, how we act on our appetite for godly leaders among us. And here's the broad scope of what I want to say to us this morning. Who we are as a congregation, who we are as a people, and what we want in the way of leadership may have a bearing on the kind of leadership that God sends us. Please get that lesson. Who we are as a people, what we are really about, what our character consists of, and what we want as a people may have some bearing on the kind of influencers, the kind of leadership that God brings into our life. I want you to see how that is borne out in the text that's before us. Here the people have an appetite for leadership. They want it. They want a king. They want leaders among them. But they want the wrong kind of leadership, and they want that leadership for the wrong kinds of reasons. And so they wanted the wrong kind of leader, and they wanted that leader for the wrong kind of reason. But what God did was give them what they wanted. He gave them, in fact, exactly what they wanted, exactly what they asked for. He gave them the kind of leader that they asked for, and really the only kind of leader that they were ready for at that time. But He did that very purposefully. The reason why God gave them a Saul is so that He could teach them to want a David. He gave them a Saul so that they could find the fulfillment for their request, and in living under 40 years of His reign, hopefully develop an appetite for God's kind of leader. And so Saul was God's pathway to giving them the kind of leader that God wanted for them. The kind of leader that would be a leader after his own heart. But it would be 40 years before they'd be ready for someone better. God had to teach them so that they could be prepared for the kind of leadership that He wanted to bring. Look at what was wrong with their request when they come to Samuel. They wanted the wrong leader, as I said, for the wrong reasons. They wanted someone who would, they said, be a judge over them and who would go out and fight their battles. They wanted a judge and they wanted a warrior. Someone who would make decisions for them as a people and someone who would fight their battles. Do you see that their request all had to do not with making them better as a people, but just making life easier for them as a people? They weren't looking for growth. They weren't looking to be more for God's purposes. They were merely looking for someone who would make their life easier and their responsibilities fewer. So if they could have a king who would make their decisions and who would fight their battles, then do you see they could stay home and farm. They could stay home and raise sheep. They could stay home and prosper. They could just get fat and happy if they just had a king to do all the hard stuff for them. And so they wanted a leader, but they wanted the wrong kind of leader, and they wanted him for the wrong kind of reasons. They weren't looking to be a better people. They weren't looking for greater glory for God. They weren't looking to fulfill God's purposes. They wanted to be more comfortable, less responsible. They wanted a leader who would let them do less, not a leader who would lead them to do more. And so that was the reason for their appetite. They wanted this leader so that they could be like the nations that surrounded them. And I just want you to see how their craving is for legitimacy as a nation. Nations are supposed to have kings, and so they wanted a king like all the neighboring nations around them. And so their desire for that all had to do with their appetite for legitimacy rather than for an appetite for things to really be better or for them to be better as a people in the eyes of God. And so what God gave them was what they asked for. He gave them a decision maker and He gave them a warrior. Saul frequently made the wrong decisions, but he made decisions. And Saul frequently fought the wrong battles, but he was a warrior, and he was a tall warrior. He was a big guy. And so he had all of the outside accoutrements of leadership. He looked like a leader, but he really wasn't the right kind of leader. He was a decision maker and a warrior like they requested, but one who did not lead them toward greener pastures. They asked for a small leader. God gave them a small leader, the leader that they wanted, so that he could prepare them for the leader that he wanted. I say all of that so that we as a people can test what our heart is for influencers among us, for leadership. And this is what I mean. We can want, if we're not careful, even in when we pray, we can ask God for the wrong kinds of things, and if that reflects the wrong kind of things in our hearts, then that needs to change. For instance, we can crave having an eldership as a people because that's what churches are supposed to do. They're supposed to have elders. And we can want to just be like other churches and have the legitimacy of having a formal eldership. And if that's the reason we want an eldership, that's wanting it for the wrong reasons. If it's just to be like everyone else, that's not a good enough reason. And so I just want to caution us about wanting something just for the sake of legitimacy, the way that Israel wanted that. And I also want to warn us about wanting leadership for the wrong kinds of reasons. They wanted a leader who would make the decisions and who would fight their battles. And we as men can crave having an eldership because it means that we won't have to have men's meetings. Or it means that we are relinquished from having to make hard decisions. Or from being involved in some of the people problems that occur in a local church. And so wanting leadership so that we can do less is really the wrong kind of appetite. And so I want to warn us about having the wrong kind of passion when it comes to leadership, because we might get what we want if our passion is misdirected and if our perspective is misdirected. And so who we are, if I could go back to that statement, who we are and what we want as a people may have some bearing on the kind of leadership that God either grows among us or that God brings to us. I want you to see how Saul was, in many respects, a reflection of where the people were as a nation. God gave them a leader who really looked a lot like them. Now, that's what they wanted. They wanted a leader who would fulfill what their dreams and their aspirations and what their vision was for them as a people. And God gave them that. But I want us to see this lesson because it as motivation for who we are. Because our leadership as a congregation will be a reflection of who we are. And that was certainly the case when it came to Israel. God gave them a leader who looked like them, one who reflected their values and one who reflected their faith. Let me illustrate that. Israel wanted to look good as a nation. They wanted to look like the nations around them because they had a king. And so you know what God did? God gave them a king who looked good. When we're introduced to David, or rather when we're introduced to Saul, look if you would at 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 2, and it says that this fellow Kish, who was Saul's father, he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man, and there was not a more handsome person than he among all the sons of Israel. From his shoulders and up, he was taller than any of the people. Saul was a good-looking guy, and he was a good-looking leader. He looked like a leader. He looked like he ought to be somebody in charge. He was head and shoulders bigger than everyone else. He was a giant in Israel. And so he looked good. And if you read the story of Saul's leadership, Saul spent the entire time of his kingship trying to look good rather than be good. At every turn, he finds his kingship threatened. He finds his leadership in peril. And Saul is always trying to look good in front of the people. He wants to look kingly. He wants to make tough decisions. He wants the people to crave and to follow him. And so he's always trying to do things that look good. And he worried more about how he looked in front of the people than he did about being good. There's one story where Saul made a boneheaded decision where he offered a sacrifice that Samuel was supposed to offer. And Samuel tells him that the kingship is going to be torn away from him, and it's going to be given to another who is a man after God's own heart. And Saul doesn't repent. Have I been saying Samuel all along? Or have I been, okay, somehow it just kind of occurred to me that maybe I was saying the wrong name as I went. But because I do that on occasion, as you might know. But as Samuel was getting ready to walk away from Saul, Saul begs him to come with him to appear in front of the people. And it's a demonstration of the kind of weak leader that Saul was, that for legitimacy, to look good in front of the people, he needed Samuel to be there. He needed Samuel by his side because he knew the people respected Samuel. And it's just an indication of how, and he does that throughout his life, he's always trying to look good rather than to be good. And so, but that's how the people were. And so that's the kind of leader God gave them. Number two, notice if you would that the people wouldn't listen to Samuel. It says in verse 19 of chapter 8, nevertheless the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, Samuel didn't care about his legacy. Samuel didn't care about being honored in front of the people. Samuel was the kind of leader who was a true servant. And so his ambitions about leadership were not misplaced in any kind of way. And so here Samuel is, and he's really trying to pursue the thing that's best for the people, persuade them of the thing that's best for them, and guess what? They won't listen to him. And so you have a people that won't listen and you won't learn, and you know what kind of king God gave them? He gave them a king who would not listen and who would not learn. Saul would never listen to anyone. He wouldn't listen to Samuel. He wouldn't listen to David. He wouldn't listen to Jonathan. He wouldn't listen to anyone that loved him best. He didn't learn anything as a leader. He stayed where he was. He never grew. And a big reason why he never grew is because he wouldn't listen. And more than anything else, he wouldn't listen to God. One of the memorable texts from the reign of Saul is found in 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 22, when Samuel rebukes Saul because he won't listen to God, and he says to him, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. That was one thing that Saul refused to do. He refused to listen to anyone, and as a result, he refused to learn. And so he was not a very good leader for that, because of that. But that's the way the people were. And so that's the way their leader was. Number three, they would not wait on God to give them the leader He wanted. They were not patient. They wouldn't wait for God's hand. And guess what kind of leader God gave them? God gave them a leader who wouldn't wait on Him either. He gave them a leader who wouldn't wait on God. The very first mistake that Saul makes in his leadership is when he's told to prepare the people for battle, but he's to wait for Samuel to come, as we've already referenced, and offer the sacrifice. He has 7 days to wait. Saul waits until the seventh day, and the day starts to draw to a close. And Saul can't wait any longer, and so he goes and offers the sacrifice that Samuel was supposed to offer. He wouldn't wait on God. But the people were that way, and he was that way. And that absence of patience, that absence of trust, that absence of waiting on the Lord and His purposes were one of the things that hurt his leadership. Number four, the people were jealous of the other nations. They were jealous of other peoples. They wanted to be like them. And so guess what? God gave them a leader who was jealous of other leadership. One of the big fallacies in Saul as a leader is he had no room in his life for any other leadership. He was threatened by anyone else that was a leader. He was so insecure about his own skills and about his own ability and his own credibility in front of the people than anyone else who had the things that he didn't have, who did have charisma with the people, who did have intuition, who did have success in what they did. They were a threat to him. And that's the reason why there was no room in his life for David, because David had those things with the people. We're told in 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 7 about how when David comes back from the slaying of Goliath, the ladies were singing that Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000s. And from that moment, Saul's heart was turned against David because he heard the people's praise. And he couldn't stand that. He was jealous of other leaders the same way that Israel was jealous of other nations. And so he lived constantly in paranoia. The people lacked faith in God's leadership and in God's purposes. That's the reason they can't wait on a king. And so God gave them a leader who was paranoid and who was paralyzed in his life by his lack of faith. One of the really comical scenes, comical but tragic scenes in Saul's leadership is when we come to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we read of how Israel is all dressed up to go fight the Philistines. I mean, they've got their armor on, and they've got their swords, and they've got their shields. And verse 11 of 1 Samuel 17 says that after they got dressed up, they all ran to the battlefield with the war cry. I mean, they were hollering and they were whooping like they were going to go out and fight some kind of great battle for God. And they got there and Goliath came out and they all stopped. They didn't fight any battles that day. And all of their chanting and all of their war cries and all of their whooping and all of their hollering, it's all for naught. I mean, they made a big show like they were going to go out and do something great, and they did nothing at all. And not only are the people trembling, but we're told that Saul himself was fearful. And so their lack of faith is reflected in his lack of faith. Trust that God would go before them and God would fight. And David's the one who counsels wisdom on that occasion when he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who dares to taunt the armies of the living God?" He talked faith on that occasion, and fortunately won the day with his talk and with his actions, because he really believed that God was the one who was their warrior. God was the one who was their decision maker. God was the one who said he would give them the land. And so let's go take the land because God promised it to us. And so he believed God's promises, not his own strength or his own abilities. He trusted in the assurance that God would do what God said he would do. He had faith in God's leadership. Number 6. The people wanted position, status, comfort, and so God gave them a king who craved all those same things. Saul was, as a king, always a positional leader. He held the office, but he didn't have the respect of the people, and he didn't have the character, credibility that was a part of being a godly man who was growing as a godly man. And so the people wanted position, they wanted status, they wanted comfort, and God gave them a king who wanted all those same kind of things, and as a result, they stopped. I mean, they just stopped. They were paralyzed the same way that he was paralyzed as a people. God gave them a king who was over them, who was before them, not a leader who was with them. One of the great demonstrations of weakness on Saul's part was the way that he motivated people. The only way that Saul ever knew how to motivate people was with a carrot and with a stick. When he wanted someone to fight Goliath, he just bribed his people. He said, if somebody will go fight Goliath, I'll let you marry my daughter and I'll make you rich. And then when he's out in the woods and they're chasing their enemies, he says, "Cursed be anyone who eats today until all the enemies of Saul are put down." The only way he knew to motivate, because he wasn't with people. He didn't understand them. He was not a leader who mingled with the people. He was always over them, above them, before them. The only way he ever knew to lead people or persuade them was by making threats or by making promises, and promises that really were empty promises. David, by contrast, was a leader who was with the people. And so he's mingling with the army when Goliath is offering his taunts. He's listening to what they're saying. He hears their worries. And he speaks to them with his own faith and his own courage. And then when he goes out and fights, he models the kind of faith and the kind of action that needed to exist among all of them. And so the people fight beside David because David fights beside them. And so the kind of leadership that he models of being with the people is very different from what they had seen under Saul. Could I say to you that what they really needed was what we really need as a people? We need the same kind of leadership that they needed, and that kind of leadership is God's kind of leadership. It's opposite of all the things that we've said. We need leaders who are trying to be good, not look good. In fact, we need leaders who will look foolish being good, not being foolish to look good. Do you see the difference? Saul did foolish things because he wanted to look good. David often looked foolish as a leader, but he looked foolish because he was being good. And we need leaders among us who will look foolish being good, not be foolish looking good. Number two, they needed and we need leaders who will listen and who will learn. Leaders who will listen and who will learn. David was a leader that listened. He listened to Jonathan. He listened to Samuel. He even listened to Saul. He listened to Abigail. He listened to those that were his circle of leadership that were around him. He listened to the people. And because David would listen, he could learn. He listened to the prophet when the prophet came and said, "You're wrong, David. You're the man." He listened to him and he learned and he got better. And so we need leadership that will listen and who will listen to God most of all, and who will learn from their mistakes. Leaders who will listen and learn are the kind of leaders we need. Number three, they needed and we need leaders who will wait and work expectantly on God. Leaders who will wait, but not just wait passively, not just wait and whistle in the corner. Leaders who will wait, but who will work while they wait and do so expectantly, knowing that God's going to show up. And when He does, man, we will really get some stuff done because He'll do all the heavy lifting. David spent much of his early days running around in the wilderness rather than sitting on the throne because he was waiting on God to fulfill the promise. And he didn't take things into his own hands. He waited for God to fulfill His purpose. Number four, we need leaders who can work with other leaders. That seems to be, that's simple, but it's so important. We need leaders that know how to work with other leaders. David was that way. You don't read at the end of Saul's reign about the circle of leaders that Saul developed. But you get to the end of David's reign in 2 Samuel chapter 23 and you read about David's mighty men. There were a lot of great leaders that were lifted up in Israel in David's reign because David had room in his heart for other great men. He didn't have to go out and fight all the battles. He didn't have to kill all the giants. He didn't have to always be the one that was in front. And so David encouraged, he developed, he equipped others around him. And so men were not afraid to do what they could do to show their strength, to do what they could do to contribute to God's purposes because David had room in his heart for other leaders. And so the people were blessed for that reason. They need and we need leaders with big faith who trust God's hand and who trust God's purposes in the face of the giant. We need people that say, leaders who say, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who dares to taunt the armies of the living God? God has promised this land. God has promised this purpose. God has said He's going to be there. And so let's stop sitting here and wringing our hands and worrying. Let's go out and fight because He's going to be there." And so we need leaders that have that kind of faith. Number six, we need leaders who are with the people, not over the people. a lot is exemplified in terms of the difference between Saul and David by what they were doing when they were called. Saul was chasing donkeys when he was called to be a king. David was tending sheep. And Saul spends his whole kingship chasing something. Not doing something, chasing something. He's always chasing, and it's always out of his grasp, and he doesn't know why. But David tended sheep. And that becomes a metaphor for his kingship. He knew how to nurture. He knew how to care. He knew how to deal with problems. He knew how to deal with wounded animals. He knew how to deal with wounded people. And so, because David had skills of compassion and skills of protection and of nurturing and of how to grow and how to care and how to protect, how to shepherd, David became a great leader because he had that kind of servant heart that was maybe began tending sheep, but was cultivated in how he interacted with people. Saul, when he was appointed as a king, went and hid in the baggage because he was awkward with people, and he lived his entire kingship. He was always afraid of the people rather than being a friend of the people. David was a friend of the people, and the people loved David because he had a heart for them. And so we need leaders who are not afraid of the people, who are not afraid of their problems, but who are friends of the people, who are with the people, who, as has been well said in the title of a familiar book, who smell like the sheep because they've been with them. Well, how do we do that? How do we develop? How do we find God's kind of leadership? 3 things I want to say to you before we close. Number 1, we've got to want that. I mean, we've got to want that kind of leadership. Because who we want, what we want, will have some bearing on what God can send to us. The people weren't ready for God's kind of leader. God couldn't send them His kind of leader until they were ready for it. So number 1, we've got to want it. Number 2, we need to invite that. I mean, we need to be in our prayers, both when we're together and when we're at home, when you pray at the table with your family, when you pray in the morning or pray at night, or when you pray, we need to invite that kind of leadership from God, that God would send us that kind of leadership. Number 3, we need to model that kind of leadership. Because remember, Saul was a reflection of the people. God sent them a leader who was like them. And so if we want that kind of person, if we want that kind of influencer to thrive among us, guess what? We got to be that kind of people. We need to be people that are like that. And it's the more we're like that, the more ready we are for God to do that. Either for God to, because it's going to happen in one of 2 ways. God is either going to grow that kind of leadership among us, or God is going to bring us that kind of leadership. But the more that we practice that, the more that we model that, the more that we want it and invite it, then the more God can either grow it among us, or the more God can bring it to us. And I expect that what He's going to do is some of both. He's going to bring us some of that leadership, and He's going to grow us some of that leadership if we want that kind of leadership. Do you want that? That's absolutely what I want for us. And I believe it's what God wants for us too. There's some truth to the fact that really all of God's Old Testament, Old Covenant leadership was about getting us ready for the leadership that we really needed. Because you take even the best leaders, the Moseses and the Davids and the Elijahs and the Daniels, and they all had things about their leadership and about their character and about their person that were askew, some things that were broken. But what they all did, the best of them got us ready for the best leader of all, who was Jesus. The one who really has it together. The one who really models the servant heart, models all of the attitudes that we talked about, and who can do for us the things that nobody can do for us. Listen, if Jesus is not your king, listen, if Jesus is not your king this morning, oh, how you need Him to be. You need His leadership. You need His direction. You don't know how to go if He's not steering the ship. You don't know where you're headed if He's not the one in charge. You need Him to be the one who rules your life. And today is a great day to begin that kind of change, that kind of walk. Won't you come to Him as we stand and as we sing?